There are 6 steps to renew your mind and transform your life, and Dr. Alan Weissenbacher will share them with his Brain Change program. We'll take a look at some rules in the Old Testament about responsibility that could help our culture today. And Zach Orvis took his love of a Midwest food staple and one of a first-of-its-kind competition that is dressing him into the Hall of Heroes. Coming up on episode 94 of Manly with Andy. Now joining the podcast, it is Dr. Alan Weissenbacher, author of the Brain Change program, 6 Steps to Renew Your Mind and Transform Your Life. Before we get into that, Doctor, let me know what you think the biggest challenge that men face today is and how do we overcome it?
I think one of the biggest challenges men face is loneliness. I think as we get older, it seems increasingly harder and harder to make meaningful friendships of deep connection where you are known and you know them. And I think this feeds into a lot of the other issues, whether it's lust or pornography. There's a definite component in there of trying to fill a connection void. And mental health issues, I think, could be lessened a lot if we had people to share our burdens with.
Well, and I know that you've done so much research about mental health and with your book, The Brain Change program, so you've seen it firsthand. I'll start with this question. I was reading your book, and it's a great book with lots of great research, and this is scientific-based research. I've been seeing this too with a few other authors I've been talking to, and they've all kind of come to the same conclusion, and I would be interested to see what you think too, that it does feel like science is finally catching up to what the Bible has been talking about for 2,000 years when it comes to brains and everything.
Yes, I thoroughly agree. The stuff I tell in the book is nothing new in terms of prayer, on thinking good things, taking every thought captive. The Bible's been telling us this all along. Now we just know the science behind it. And the fact that what the Bible has been telling us extends all the way down into the biology of our brain, literally changing it physically.
That's really cool. So let's get going with the book here now. I liked the first chapter. It's titled Life Change, Microwave or Crock Pot. And you talk about that there's two kind of, you look in the Bible and you say there's the Paul program and the Jacob program. So let's talk about the two differences there and which one we're probably more likely in program-wise.
Well, everyone wants the Paul program. That's God zapped me into holy righteousness, have it be an instant, and then I can go on with my life. Even modern day society, we want things now. And those stories do happen, but they're also rare. What most people are on the Jacob program. Jacob was a manipulator and a deceiver, and he was put on a 14-year treatment program working for an uncle who was just as lying and deceitful as he was. In the tension and struggle of his program, his character slowly changed, which was then symbolized in the wrestling with the angel and a changing of his name. But it took a lot of years. And we can go into this more. I worked with homeless addicts, and most of them, they're on the Jacob program, the long, hard struggle of change. But then I would encourage them saying, who would you rather have as a mentor? Someone that was zapped instantly or someone that fought a long, hard fight and was successful?
That's a good word. In chapter 2, I thought this was interesting. You talk about shaping personal character. You say neural networks with a high probability of activation manifest themselves in our expressions of character. In other words, our personal character emerges from our brain activity. And we can shape our character by harnessing the power of automaticity to ingrain positive, healthy habits and behaviors into our lives. So it's kind of cool because I think, a lot of us, especially guys, we have this reputation of, this is the way I am, especially when we get older. This is me. Can't change it, can't teach an old dog new tricks. But talk about that, because that's kind of a heady thing for most of us. So the power of automaticity to ingrain positive, healthy habits and behaviors into our lives. How do we do that? How do we shape our character through our habits?
To start with an example, if you're going sledding and you have a fresh snow hill, you can pretty much sled wherever you want. But after you've been sledding a long time, to create a new track is really hard. You fall into the old ones and they just slide you down. That is like how it is in our brain. When we're first doing something, it's like a fresh snow hill. But the more we do life, we create these big sled furrows in our brain that become the way we do things automatically. And then to change takes some work, but you can make a new path. I also use an example of a superhighway or a tiny deer path. The things you do the most are the neurons that become superhighways. They become so strong, your brain just takes that automatically. If someone's been involved in a lot of pornography and they see an attractive woman, the first thing that they think is not going to be sister in Christ. That's the unused path. And it's become biological at this point. But through taking effort and redirecting to that small path over and over, maybe 60 times a minute when you start, each time you make that conscious change, you take one brick off the superhighway and put it on the path. And so you begin to dismantle this old habit. It's not easy. And you create a new one. And so hopefully then the good things will become automatic because you create those as your new automatic pathways.
I believe I read in your book too that you talked about how sometimes people will say, well, it's 20 days to change habits or 40 days to change habits. So what have you found in your research and experience?
No.
I don't know if that's good news or bad news.
Well, it depends on the person and how entrenched a particular habit or problem is. Someone where something might not be so deeply entrenched, 30 days might be okay for 30 days. But for the addicts I used to work with, people coming off the streets with 20, 30, 40 years of addiction, it took 1 to 2 years. But the good news is the more work you put in, the easier it gets. So you've put in 30 days, you've moved a few bricks in your brain, and it's easier than it was when you first started.
One story that really hit me in your book, I thought it was really cool, is when you were working with addicts and you found that they would do really well, and then all of a sudden, every 2 weeks, they would just really want to go back. So explain that story and what it has to do with triggers in our life.
This was a riddle for the staff at this rehabilitation facility. A certain segment of the population, every 2 weeks, like clockwork, you could time it on your watch, they would get a craving. And then it would pass, and then 2 weeks later, it would hit them again. This was so strange. And then we realized that this was a biological thing going on because this group was the people that were able to still hold jobs in their addiction. And every 2 weeks is when they would get their paycheck. And then they would use their paycheck and go out and indulge. And even though they were now in rehabilitation, their brain still had what I call knots. And so the internal time clock was knotted up with addiction on a 2-week time schedule. They formed their brain that way. And so the brain was telling them, it's been 2 weeks. Where's my drug? And then get this craving.
That's just incredible. And I'm just trying to think in our lives, how many things are like that just on autopilot? And how do we figure that out in our everyday of, for me, I'm just thinking, I struggle a lot with sweets and stuff. And it's just, how do I figure out what my trigger is when I want something sweet?
These brain knots, that is the science behind triggers. You associate one thing with another. It can be something just neutral. Like for most of us in our culture, green means go, red means stop. They're just colors. But in our brains, because of the way we drive, it's become linked with a certain action and enables traffic safety. It's a good thing. But the same process can link someone's face with anger. And that makes forgiveness really hard because it's become biologically linked. Or I need comfort. I go to the sweets. Or life throws me a curveball. First thing I think, what's my biggest highway for comfort? Might be sweets, might be alcohol. For someone, it might be anger when life throws them a curveball. Or I talk to people sometimes too, what's knotted up in your brain with God? For our clients, some of them had bad dads. Then when someone says God is Father, that whole link of the troubles with their own father also become linked up with God. And so I just tell them, we can work on your link, but until then, how about you just think of God as shepherd?
That ties into something that I thought was really interesting too. When you said, often we pray for what we want to change as if we could will God into making it happen. But you say, when it doesn't happen, what should we do? What's the alternative? Don't pray backward, pray forward.
And this is just what I talk about with brain change to help make your life a little easier. One thing I noticed in my prayer life is I'd get so stressed after I prayed. I'm supposed to be taking things to God, but why am I so stressed? I just gathered 12 problems and I may have prayed about them, but I still just thought about 12 problems and I'm stressed out. So throwing that in, I also bring up the idea that willpower doesn't work. And so if you're trying to make a change and you're thinking, must not use alcohol, what are you thinking about? the alcohol. And you're making it harder for yourself because you're making that path bigger in your very act of trying to resist. And so to relate that to prayer, realize the problem was I was praying focused on the problem. And so to use some of the examples I just brought up, if you're saying, "Dear Lord, help me not use alcohol," it's the same thing as the willpower. You have alcohol on the brain. "Dear Lord, help me not use sweets." The sweets are on the brain. And so call that praying backward. God can still work, definitely. But if you switch the prayer to praying forward, instead of saying, "God, keep me away from alcohol," instead, "God, help me be sober." You're praying forward to the solution. And so you're focusing on the sobriety. You're focusing on whatever it is good. And so your brain begins to form its highways in that direction.
That reminds me of the other thing, and I shared this because I just thought it was such a cool thing. The pink elephant paradox.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing. And it's great too. So talk a little bit about that, because I think, oh man, how often is this the struggle that we have where we're thinking about the things we don't want to think about?
Yeah. If I tell someone, "Don't think of a pink elephant," what'd you just do? You thought of that elephant. "Don't use alcohol." What'd you think about? The alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
I still remember a field trip in the 5th grade where the bus happened to drive through a bad neighborhood of San Francisco. And the teacher stood up and said, "I know where we are right now. I want you to wipe it all from your minds." And that is the one reason why I remember that today.
Right.
And so the thing is to not focus on the problem. When I tell people, don't resist your problem, replace it with something good. Instead of, don't think of the pink elephant. Instead, tell someone the thing you want to think about.
So let's jump to the chapter, Neurons That Fire Together, Wire Together. And you talk about emotional reframing. You say it's important to note that previous emotional states impact new emotional states.
This is one way to try to help change your brain. We talked about these knots. And so if someone who hurt me, I've been thinking about them in anger, their face and their name have become linked with anger. And if I think of one, there goes the O. And even if I tell myself I've forgiven, I still feel angry. It's biological. And so you need to start putting in some different emotions to loosen that knot, to cut it with something different. The Bible says, pray for your enemies. What is that doing in your brain? It's putting a different emotion into that anger mix and hopefully break it and loosen it up. In terms of emotional reframing, it could be someone cuts you off in traffic and you tend to get upset about that. To then think, step back and try to put yourself in their shoes. What I do with my kids to try to train them early is, okay, this person just did something stupid on the road. Can you tell me some reasons why they might have done that? We automatically go to, because they're evil and I must punish them with a middle finger gesture. No, maybe they're in a hurry. Maybe there's a medical emergency. Maybe they're distracted. And to begin to think differently so that the next time that happens, you don't automatically move to the worst case.
I end up doing that on my own sometimes, and it's sarcastic, so I don't know if this is helpful, but sometimes I'll go, boy, that must be a doctor in needing to get to an emergency surgery. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when my second was born, we cut it pretty close. I was going really fast down the road to the hospital, and we made it with 15 minutes to spare. I was saying our second was almost born on College Avenue. If I wouldn't go, we would get it.
Well, let's jump to this. My life verse is that God is able to do infinitely more than we can ever ask or imagine, Ephesians 3:20. And so I love that chapter 4 is the power of imagination. It becomes reality. So talk about your research, because I thought it was so fascinating, just the research about even thinking about exercise and what it does, and just the power of positive thinking there.
The power of the imagination. This is one in my research that just really took me back, in that your brain cannot tell the difference between imagining doing something and actually doing it in terms of how it forms your brain. That's huge. And that goes back to the Bible. The Bible's been telling us this all along. You can end up sinning in your imagination. And we all get temptation, but if you hold on to it long enough, it's actually forming your brain in that direction. You brought up the experiments when they had people just practice playing the piano only in their imagination. And they showed the same improvement as someone that practiced for real. They've done it with exercise. The groups didn't improve the same. It's people who do exercise for real improve the most. But those that just exercised in their brain showed a little improvement. Whoa. And that tells me, it goes back to, what am I imagining? What am I thinking about? that is forming me in my head. Am I imagining punching my coworker? I might think I'll never do that in real life, but the more I imagine it, the more it becomes possible because I'm changing my own brain. I brought this up in the book. A client told me when it came to cheating on my wife, it was easy because I did it 100 times before in my head.
That's so powerful.
You can train yourself to do good things and make automatic behaviors in your imagination if you think about it beforehand. Like with our clients, we had a client that was worried about running into an ex-girlfriend on a weekend pass and falling back into addiction. And we just said, okay, imagine meeting her and doing the right thing and do it over and over and over again in your head. Eventually on a weekend pass, he did run into his ex-girlfriend. And he said, my body turned around and I was 2 blocks away before I even consciously thought of what I was doing. It might be a little strange, but all of a sudden just like, boom, go. But he said, I had trained my brain that was just automatic once I hit that situation. And he's still sober.
I love that. Pastor Craig Groeschel talks about that a lot. And I think he has a new book where he talks about it, where he says, you have to pre-decide. You have to pre-decide what you're going to do in a situation like that. And I think so often Alan, we'll walk into a situation and go, I don't know what to do.
He's spot on. Train yourself beforehand about where your decision is going to be. So it's not a curveball. You're not caught flat-footed. Like, what am I going to do? It's like, okay, I've imagined this. I know what my decision's going to be. I can make the good one. And I've rehearsed it in my brain so much that it's automatic and becomes easy.
Those pathways again. I love that. Yeah. Let's go through what the 6 steps are. What's the first step? Where do we start?
Well, first of all, you just need to identify what the issue is. To identify whatever thought or behavior you want to change. And if it's a certain behavior, then begin to go through, okay, what kind of thoughts lie behind it? What's feeding into it? What kind of thoughts do I need to change to address the pornography issue or my anger issue or whatever it might be? And once you identify that thought, then okay, now I can work on changing it. This is my highway. Now I can work on getting that different. And the step 2 is evaluating that, just as part of the thought process. And then step 3, replace, don't resist. I mentioned that. So instead of that, don't think of the pink elephant, must not do this sin, I'm just thinking about sin, is to replace it with something new and something healthy. This is why I would take the addicts often to do mission projects in Mexico. It's like, and people would tell us, are you crazy? You're taking a bunch of addicts to Juarez, Mexico. But it went wonderfully because they were so focused on building an orphanage that the addiction wasn't a problem for them because we had put that replacement there for them. And so don't do the resisting, instead do the replacing. Whatever true, noble, good, think of these things. Then you have these brain knots, step 5. So you're going to need to introduce a new emotion. And so you have this knot in your head. Like if it's unforgiveness, you're going to start praying for your enemies, put a new emotion into it. Reframe your thinking to put some kind of new emotion. Have a community supporting you. So when you make good decisions, they're cheering you on. And so that puts new emotion into it. We had one client one time that was going to throw a rock into the face of another client. And he thought about it and dropped the rock. But he told me later, I feel like less of a man. Like I didn't stand up for myself because I dropped that rock. Because he came to us from the prison system and he was trained that violence meant you were a man. And so we had to put a new emotion into that to break that link. And so we just cheered him on, encouraged him. You did the right thing from dropping that rock. And we excessively praised him so that it really sunk in and helped put a new emotion to break that link. And so that's the introduce a new element. And then finally, you need to do this over and over and over again. I say it's not a magic pill, it's a discipline. And you're not going to shrink a superhighway overnight. You're likely on the Jacob program. And so you need to run these steps over and over and over again. They eventually get easier and easier. And then you create new brain paths so that doing good becomes your automatic response.
Now taking a look at the Bible, Deuteronomy 22, starting in verse 1. If you see your neighbor's ox or sheep or goat wandering away, don't ignore your responsibility. Take it back to its owner. If its owner does not live nearby or you don't know who the owner is, take it to your place until the owner comes looking for it. Then you must return it. Do the same if you find your neighbor's donkey, clothing, or anything else your neighbor loses. Don't ignore your responsibility. If you see that your neighbor's donkey or ox has collapsed on the road, do not look the other way. Go and help your neighbor get it back on its feet. And I love that in that little section, it says twice, Don't ignore your responsibility. I think about Cain and Abel's story, where God says, well, where's your brother? To Cain, and he says, am I my brother's keeper? How often do we ignore our responsibilities? The things that we know are right, but we go, someone else will do it. Well, in this world, no one else will do it. And this is the way that we, as men of God, can step up and show God's power in this world by showing who he is through what we do. Now entering the Hall of Heroes, Zach Orvis, who on Labor Day weekend found a new way to celebrate the spirit of hard work, participating in a ranch dressing chugging contest. And with nothing but a sturdy stomach and a love for the creamy condiment, Zach overtook 11 other brave souls and downed a full 24 ounces of ranch in just 10 seconds, earning him the title of Michigan's first ranch chugging champion. And although Zach did win a gift card and all the wings he could eat at the restaurant, it wasn't about that. It was celebrating the wonders of the human body, pushing it to its limits, and boldly going where no ranch goer has gone before. So because Zach Orvis proved that not only does ranch go on everything, but it doesn't have to go on anything, he is officially in the Manly with Andy Hall of Heroes. If you want to aim your life and influence toward the glory of God, Dan Bennett will share how from his book, My Fame, His Fame. God told the Israelites to do something pretty unique when they crossed into the promised land. That's good for us too. And what one dad did during the aftermath of Hurricane Helene to make sure he didn't miss his daughter's wedding is hiking him into the Hall of Heroes. Coming up next week on Manly with Andy. Manly with Andy is a Wow God production. Discover more at wowgod.com.